Yes, you heard it right. It's not an April Fool joke nor a piece of fake news. We did find the lost text of the poor Tutankhamun, even if this story is not new since it dates back to 2015, but I bet you didn't know about it. Before revealing the whole story to you, I will begin by explaining the context that led to this whole situation. As you know, in 1922, the Egyptologist Howard Carter discovered the almost well-preserved tomb of King Tutankhamun. On this subject, if you want to know more about it, I suggest you watch the video 5 Unknown Anecdotes about the tomb of Tutankhamun. In 1923, after many months spent studying the funerary furniture of the first room of a tomb called the antechamber because it's located just before the burial chamber, the English Egyptologist finally reached the most important room of the royal tomb. There, he discovered the first enormous chapel in gilded wood which occupied almost all the space of the burial chamber. The seals that initially closed it had been broken by thieves in ancient times. On the other hand, when discovering a second chapel almost as large, they had given up on taking care of a real mummy for a moment, leaving the seals intact and had preferred to focus on jewels that were stored in the next room, called by the archaeologists the treasury. Fortunately for the late king, the looters were caught in or near the tomb and did not have time to desecrate the mummy. Carter, like the looters, also had to be patient because the king's body had been protected not only by 4 enormous chapels but also by huge sarcophagus made of granodiorite, 2 gilded wooden coffins and 1 solid gold coffin. Between the problems he had with the authorities which stopped the excavations, the slowness of the dismantling of the fragile gilded wooden chapels, and the time needed for the logistic, including the removal of the coffins from the sarcophagus, no less than 2 years were necessary for the Egyptologists to access the mummy. For religious reasons, and certainly to stop any thieves from reaching the mummy of Tutankhamun, black resin was poured over the solid gold coffin until it was drowned in a black mass as hard as concrete once it had solidified. Here we see Howard Carter bending over the solid gold coffin, using a tool to break off the black resin bit by bit. A complicated and fastidious task began to carry weight on the Egyptologist's passions. When he finally managed to free the golden lid and discovered the royal mummy covered with its famous golden mask, he had the unpleasant surprise of noticing that the mummy and the mask were stuck to the bottom of the coffins by the same black resin. Without any concerns about the conservation of the royal body, Howard Carter then used the most extreme means. On October 31st, 1925, indicated in his excavation notebook, a trial therefore was made for several hours in sun, temperature reaching as high as 149 Fahrenheit, 65 degrees Celsius. Yes, you read correctly. He exposed the fragile royal mummy to 65 degrees. No need to be an expert to understand the irreparable damage that was done to the mummy and its poor state of preservation. After several attempts that would cause further irreparable damage to the mummy, Howard Carter called Dr. Douglas Derry to the rescue. He arrived in the Valley of the Kings on November 11, 1925, with his colleague Dr. Saleh Bey Hamdi. In this photo, we see Dr. Derry bending over the mummy in the presence of his colleague, Howard Carter, the French Egyptologist Pierre Lacan, who represents the Service of Egyptian Antiquities, and several Egyptian officials. We don't know who had the brilliant idea to tear off the head of a king to better remove a mask, but none of them hesitated to degrade the body of a king. And if Howard Carter did not mention the way he had succeeded in removing the mask from the mummy, he had no problem in publishing in his report pictures of the head thus ripped off. But the worst is yet to come. To remove more easily the mummy that was still stuck to the bottom of a coffin with the black resin, the team of Howard Carter decided to cut the body in half through the belly. Even worse than that, they had proceeded in butchering the mummy at its wrist, elbows, shoulders and ankles to remove its jewels more easily. An absolute scandal, a disgrace and a real shame on the profession of Egyptologist, which despite this has been hardly denounced when the facts have not been hidden. In 1968, the mummy of Tutankhamun was temporarily taken out of its tomb to undergo a series of X-rays. When it emerged from these various examinations, the mummy, already in pieces, could hardly stand on a wooden board. It was therefore decided to place it in a sandbox in which the different limbs would be stabilized and reconnected. But when the mummy returned to his tomb, it was a shock. Tutankhamun's sex had disappeared. The mystery was absolute, and some concluded that someone had taken a real member. In 2015, the 11th International Congress of Egyptology was held in Florence. One of the communications I attended was given by the Swiss Egyptologist Frank Rouly. The conference was fascinating and dealt with the identification of real mummies. In summary, it explained how it was possible to determine that such and such mummies were indeed that of such and such kings. Concerning Ramesses II, for example, we knew it was him because an inscription on his coffin allowed us to identify him. For Tutankhamun, it was easy, simply because he had been found in his tomb. Above or later, Frank Rouly then added that his sex had been found. Of course, I was very curious to know how he had been recovered, so I went to find him at the end of the session and asked him a question. And there, he told me that the sex had not been stolen and that he had remained all this time in the tomb. In fact, the mummy was in such a state of preservation that, with the jolts, the king's member had become detached and he had simply slipped under the sand of a tube. It was found when the king was taken out of his tomb for new radiological examinations. From now on, the martyred body of a king rests in his tomb. It's exposed under glass in the left part of the antechamber, a sheet modestly covering his body, not only out of respect for the deceased sovereign, but also to hide the atrocious misdeeds committed by Howard Carter and his team. If you want to know more about the subjects, I suggest you read my book, The Tomb of Tutankhamun, The Other Side of a Story.